Hello, everyone. Welcome to Revolutionary America, Part 1, The Beginning. Let's start at the beginning. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. You know what? This is a really long book. Let's fast forward to 1492. In 1492, there was a guy named Christopher Columbus, great Italian. He decided that the world was round, and you could sail west from where you are in Europe all the way to India, grab some spices, and sail east all the way back to Europe and sell them for a large profit. While all these other mathematicians were sitting in their mother's basements calculating the circumference of the earth correctly, Christopher Columbus got in his big boy pants, went around Europe saying, hey, who's going to finance my trip west and make tons of gold? No one was really interested except for the king and queen of Spain, Ferdinand and Isabella. They just got done reuniting Spain, and they said, you know what, we'll give this guy a shot. So they gave him 3 boats, the Nina, the Pinta, and the Santa Maria. Columbus goes west, doesn't hit India like he thought, hits this other land, which we eventually call America, goes back to Europe and tells everyone, and he's the last person to discover the new world. And for that, he's going to get all the credit. Spain starts sending people out west, and they discover there's a bunch of stuff in the new world that we could sell in Europe for a lot of money instead of spices. So they start going, hey, take me to your leader. Let's start some trade. They discover there's not really a lot of leadership in the Caribbean. Start taking that over. Go further west into Mexico. Say, hey, take me to your leader. They say, we don't like our leader. It's the Aztecs. They're sacrificing us. And the Spanish go, hey, you don't like the people ruling your land? You got a problem. We know how to solve it. Let's make a deal. So the Spanish help the locals overthrow the Aztecs. Everything's going great. They're stealing a bunch of gold. They're sending it to Europe. They're becoming filthy rich. The rest of Europe takes notice and say, we want a piece of that action. Countries like England, France, the Netherlands, they start going into the Caribbean, getting some islands there, growing some stuff to send back home. And instead of going south like the Spanish are running into some trouble with the Incans and the Mayas, they go into North America. And when they say, take me to your leader, you know what? They find out this place doesn't really have a lot of leadership. They have some tribes running around like the old Europeans used to, but they don't really have any kings, they don't really have any emperors, no one they could really make a lot of trade agreements with. This is a good point to get into de facto and de jure. De facto means in fact, and de jure means by law. I bring this up because you can say you own something according to law, like I could write a law saying I own the moon, but in fact, I don't have anyone to enforce it, so no one owns the moon. So if I'm in Europe, and I write a law saying I own parts of North America, but there's no one there to say that this part of North America belongs to me, then I, in fact, de facto, do not own that part of North America. So the Europeans decide the best way to solve this is to send a bunch of people that are loyal to your country over to the New World. How do they do this? Well, they encourage people who have been, kicked out for religious persecution, or want to make a lot of money, or just searching for a better life. They'll go all the way across the ocean, which is not easy at the time, and then settle in the New World. And then those people, by European law, in actual fact, start owning parts of the New World. It was an interesting place. There were pioneers, natives, freedom, lawlessness, and lots of opportunity. It was a real Wild West, if you will. Let's fast forward again to 1753. The British and the French, much like cats and dogs, hate each other. Everything is normal. In North America, there are 13 colonies under British rule: New Hampshire, Massachusetts, Rhode Island, Connecticut, New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Delaware, Maryland, Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia. West Virginia is still part of Virginia. Maine is actually part of Massachusetts, and Vermont is part of New York. In North America, there are oceans to the east, the French to the north and the west, and the Spanish to the south. Each of the 13 colonies has its own local government, sponsored and chartered by the King of England. This is to say that instead of having to try and rule the colonies directly, each colony has its own government so they can rule locally. This includes a legislative body of people that are elected locally by the people in the colonies, and they're the ones that basically hold all the power, make the laws, repeal the laws, although sometimes they have a royal governor over them. There are a lot of British colonists in the 13 colonies, a lot more than French colonists in French Canada. However, the 13 colonies are not nearly as profitable as the plantations in the Caribbean. Even though there are a lot of plantations in America, what people are buying is mostly the sugar cane and the tobacco and other things from the Caribbean islands. You got to understand that a lot of the East Coast is mostly swampland. That's Virginia, Maryland, a lot of the Carolinas, even New Jersey and parts of New York. But people still were moving there and were still being productive and having kind of a profit for England, even though it was better for them to go into the Caribbean and grow things there. West of the mountains in French-controlled territory, that is to say that a bunch of the Native Americans there are loyal to France and say that France owns it, is this wonderful place called the Ohio River Valley. It is not a bunch of swampland. It is nice flat land where it's going to be easy to grow a bunch of crops. Britain is very interested in owning all this land, and they know in order to own this land, you need to have people there that say that you own this land and are willing to defend your claim. Because of this, the British start moving people west. The first place they're going to get to is western Pennsylvania in what is now Pittsburgh. The French realize this, so they send a military expedition south from Canada and build a fortification known as Fort It's pronounced Duquesne, but it's spelled Duchesne. In what is now Pittsburgh, Britain sends British soldiers and Virginia militia west to show the French who's trespassing on whose territory. And in the first engagement of what becomes the French and Indian War, a man named George Washington ambushes some French soldiers. Get used to hearing that name. The French and Indian War starts going kind of bad for the British until it starts getting kind of good for the British, and eventually they claim all of the territory east of the Mississippi, except for the parts in the south that are owned by Spain, as well as taking control of French Canada. Now, I believe the French and Indian War is actually not a part of the 7 Years' War, because if it was part of the 7 Years' War, it would have been called the 9 Years' War. But the 7 Years' War was caused by the 9 Years' War. So let's get into the 7 Years' War, which is actually more important for the history of America. On one side, you have England, Hanover, where the King of England is actually from, Prussia, and sometimes Russia. On the other side of the conflict, you have France, Austria, Sweden, and sometimes Russia. It's kind of a mess. There's fighting in North America, there's fighting in South America, there's fighting in India, there's fighting in the Pacific, there's fighting in Africa, and there's fighting in Europe. In Europe, most of the fighting is done by this place called Prussia, and this guy, their leader, Frederick, does so much fighting and kicks so much butt that he becomes known as Frederick the Great. England, in the meantime, is fighting a lot in other parts of the world, and eventually they also start winning. At the end of the war, Britain takes control of Canada from France, and France also relinquishes their claim of all the land east of the Mississippi River to England, as stated earlier, while a bunch of French colonists from Arcadia move to Louisiana and eventually speak English so poorly they become known as Cajuns. The rest of the French colonists stay in Canada under British rule. A portion of the British armed forces in North America were actually made of colonial militia like the Virginia militia. They contributed to the victories in the Ohio and the Canadian campaigns for the British. Much like how the 13 colonies wasn't really profitable for the British, Canada and the Ohio River Valley weren't really that profitable for the French. So in the peace negotiations, they elected to keep the Caribbean islands that the British took over and relinquish their control of their territories in North America. What the colonists generally see, though, is that in the theater that they're fighting in, they took over all this territory for England, even though there was combat in the Caribbean and other parts of the world. Without getting into details, England and Prussia and their allies probably should have lost the 7 Years' War, but they still managed to win. Of note is a small Germanic state of Hesse, which contributed over 20,000 soldiers. They will come up later. After the war, Prussia was depleted militarily and didn't expand territorially at all, probably starting a tradition of the Prussians being really good at fighting, not getting anything out of it, and sacrificing a generation of their young men. Britain, however, did not suffer such high casualties. They managed to gain lots of territory in North America, and now had supplanted France as a predominant power on the global stage. This means that they are now the greatest challenge to another country trying to gain power, and are therefore a threat to the rest of the world. It is now 1763, the war is over. Britain has won, but now has several problems. It is in a large amount of debt thanks to financing the Prussians. No one wants to be their allies or trading partners because this would only serve to strengthen them further. And they have strong enemies in Europe, such as France and Spain. In the territories that they have gained in North America, there's a large presence of Native Americans that have been allied with the French and are no friend to the British. The British colonists, however, see this as new opportunities. They have new lands that they just gained access to, they have a bunch of war heroes coming home, and everything seems to be going well for the British Empire. However, this is not the case, and the relationship between the colonies and the British Empire is about to change forever. More to follow out here.